My uncle called it a formality. That was the word he used standing at the head of the dining room table in my grandmother's house. The one she'd lived in for 41 years, the one that still smelled like her lavender hand cream, even though she'd been gone for 6 weeks. He said it the way people say, obviously, or of course like anyone who questioned it had simply missed the point. It's a formality, Claire. The estate has already been handled. I was 29 years old. I had driven 4 hours from Ottawa to Barrie in a February snowstorm to attend the reading of my grandmother's will. And my uncle was standing there in a blazer that cost more than my monthly rent, telling me it was a formality. I smiled. I said, "Of course." I didn't believe him for a second. My grandmother, Doris, was the kind of woman who kept receipts for everything. Not because she was paranoid, because she believed that clarity was a form of kindness. She used to say that vague promises were just lies given extra time. She wrote things down. She documented things. She had a filing cabinet in her bedroom that she called her paper brain, and every year on my birthday, she would send me a card with a $20 bill inside and a handwritten note that said the exact same thing. "You are sharper than you know. Don't let them dull you." She owned a house in Barrie that her husband, my grandfather, who died when I was 12, had paid off completely. She also had an RRSP account and a small non-registered investment portfolio that her financial advisor estimated at somewhere around $280,000 combined. Not a fortune, but real money. The kind of money that changes things for a person starting out. She had 2 children, my mother Linda and my uncle Raymond. My mother is gentle. She is the kind of person who apologizes when other people bump into her. She has worked as an educational assistant for 22 years. She drives a 2014 Civic that she bought used and has never once complained about. My uncle Raymond is not like my mother. Raymond runs a property management company in Barrie that has been, depending on who you ask, either expanding aggressively or bleeding money quietly. He lives in a house in Innisfil that has a heated garage and a putting green in the backyard. His wife does not work. His son, my cousin Braden, is 24 and has a lease on a BMW 3 Series that someone is clearly paying for. For the last 3 years of my grandmother's life, Raymond was her primary caregiver. He drove her to appointments. He managed her banking. He had power of attorney. That last part is the part that matters. The lawyer's name was Mr. Hennessy, and he had an office above a dental clinic on Dunlop Street. He was older, soft-spoken, and he kept glancing at Raymond in a way I couldn't quite read, not deferential exactly, but cautious. Like a man who had said something in a room once and was still hoping no one had heard it. My mother and I sat on one side of the table. Raymond and his wife Diane sat on the other. Braden was there too, leaning back in his chair like he'd already won something. Mr. Hennessy read the will. It was shorter than I expected. My grandmother left the house to be split equally between my mother and Raymond. The investment accounts, the RRSP. The portfolio were to be distributed through the estate, divided equally between the 2 children, with a specific note that a portion was to be set aside in trust for the grandchildren, Braden on Raymond's side, and me on my mother's. The note specified $40,000 each. When Mr. Hennessy finished reading, Raymond reached across the table and put his hand over my mother's in this performative gesture of warmth that made my skin crawl. "Obviously, the house proceeds will take time," he said. "We'll need to list it, get it appraised. But Linda, you know I'll make sure you're taken care of." My mother nodded and said, "Of course, Ray." I said, "What about the investment accounts?" Raymond looked at me. Just for a moment, less than a second, something shifted behind his eyes. Then he smiled. "The accounts went through some changes over the last couple of years," he said. "Mom made some decisions. You know how she was, very independent." "What kind of changes?" "Claire," my mother said my name quietly. "A warning. I'm just asking," I said. Mr. Hennessy cleared his throat. "The details of the account transfers will be included in the estate documentation. Your mother's executor, Mr. Kowalski here, will provide a full accounting in due course." Raymond was the executor. I wrote that down on the notepad I'd brought. I write everything down. My grandmother taught me that. Due course turned out to be 11 weeks. 11 weeks of my mother calling Raymond and getting voicemail. 11 weeks of the accountant is still finalizing things, and these processes take time, Linda, you know that. 11 weeks of Braden posting photos on Instagram from what appeared to be a ski trip in Whistler. I am a paralegal. I work for a small firm in Ottawa that does mostly civil litigation and estate work. I know what an executor's obligations are under Ontario's Estates Act. I know what the timelines are. I know that 11 weeks without a formal accounting is not a process delay. It's a choice. I didn't say any of this to my mother. She wanted to believe her brother was handling it. What I did instead was start making calls. The first call was to my grandmother's financial advisor, a woman named Patricia, who worked out of a TD branch in Barrie. Patricia was warm and professional and told me she couldn't discuss account details with me directly, which I expected. But she paused before she hung up and said, "I do hope the estate is being handled carefully. Your grandmother was very specific about her wishes when we last met." When we last met? When was that? I asked. "About 14 months before she passed," Patricia said. And then, very quietly, she came in alone that day. I thanked her and hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then I submitted a formal request through the estate for a full accounting of all account activity over the last 3 years, citing Section 49 of the Estates Act. I CC'd the Law Society referral I'd been sitting on for 2 weeks. I sent it registered mail. Raymond called my mother that evening. She said he seemed annoyed. The accounting arrived 3 weeks later. It came in a manila envelope with Raymond's company letterhead, not from a lawyer, not from an accountant, just from Raymond's own office, which told me something right there. I spread the pages out on my kitchen table, and I went through them, line by line. The RRSP had been drawn down to nearly zero over a period of 22 months. Withdrawals between $8,000 and $15,000, spaced out in a pattern that stayed just under thresholds that would trigger certain reporting requirements. The stated reason on each withdrawal was medical expenses and living costs. My grandmother had provincial health coverage. She had a supplemental plan through my grandfather's former employer. Her prescription costs were covered. Her home care was partially subsidized. The medical expenses that would have required that level of cash withdrawal simply did not exist, not at that scale, not consistently, for nearly 2 years. The portfolio had been liquidated in 2 large transactions. The proceeds had been transferred to an account I didn't recognize. The account was listed only by number, no institution name. The trust allocations for the grandchildren, the $40,000 each that my grandmother had specifically written into her will, were listed as pending, subject to estate liquidity. There was no estate liquidity. Because the estate had been drained, I added it up. Between the RRSP withdrawals and the portfolio liquidation, approximately $241,000 had moved out of my grandmother's accounts in the last 2 years of her life, under Raymond's power of attorney, with no corresponding documentation of where it went. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 a.m., and I thought about my grandmother in that TD branch 14 months before she died, coming in alone, talking to Patricia about her wishes. I thought about the filing cabinet she called her paper brain. My mother still had a key to the Barrie house. It hadn't sold yet, the market had been slow, and Raymond hadn't officially listed it, which was its own problem, but a useful one for my purposes. I drove up on a Saturday. My mother came with me. I told her I wanted to pick up a few of Grandma's things before the house was emptied, which was true. But I also wanted the filing cabinet. It took us 3 hours to go through it. My grandmother had kept records of everything. Utility bills going back to 2009, her husband's pension statements, birthday cards organized by year, and in the very back of the bottom drawer, in a folder labeled Raymond POA, in her careful handwriting, a set of documents that she had clearly been collecting and keeping, quietly, on her own. Bank statements, her own copies, from before Raymond had access to her online banking. Account summaries she'd printed and dated and annotated in the margins with small, precise notes in blue ink. One note, next to a December statement from 3 years ago, said, "R says this is for the property tax. Property tax is not due until February. Ask Patricia." Another, next to a $12,000 withdrawal. "R says medical. What medical? I feel fine." And then, near the end of the folder, a single printed email. It was an exchange between Raymond and Diane. My grandmother had printed it. I don't know how she got it. Whether Raymond had left himself logged in on her computer, whether she'd found it some other way. But she had printed it, and she had put it in this folder, and she had written one word in the margin next to it. The word was, "Why?" The email was from 8 months before she died. Raymond had written to Diane, "The Whistler thing is covered. Use the portfolio partial. She won't notice at this point, cognition is slipping." Diane had replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. My grandmother's cognition was not slipping. I had visited her 5 months before she died, and we had done the crossword together, and she had beaten me soundly and laughed about it. I photographed every document. I photographed the margins. I photographed that email printout 3 times from different angles. Then I called a lawyer, not Mr. Hennessy, a different lawyer, one who specialized in estate litigation, based in Toronto, recommended by a colleague at my firm. Her name was Adriana, and she had the calm, precise energy of someone who had seen this exact situation many times and had stopped being surprised by it and was now simply effective. "This is financial elder abuse," she said, on our first call. "Under Ontario law, what you're describing, the systematic withdrawal under POA for non-authorized purposes, is a breach of fiduciary duty at minimum and potentially criminal fraud." "I know," I said. "Does your mother know?" "She's starting to understand. She needs to be prepared for this to be adversarial." My mother, to her credit, when I sat her down and showed her everything, every statement, every margin note, that email did not cry. She went very quiet. Then she said, "She knew. Your grandmother knew, didn't she?" "Yes," I said. "I think she was trying to document it." My mother pressed her lips together. Then she said, "Okay, what do we do?" Adriana filed an application to pass accounts with the Superior Court of Justice of formal demand that Raymond, as executor, produce a complete and verified accounting of every transaction made under the power of attorney and through the estate. She also filed a concurrent application to have Raymond removed as executor on the basis of conflict of interest and breach of fiduciary duty. Raymond's response, through a lawyer he hired in Barrie, was that all withdrawals had been made at my grandmother's direction and for her benefit, that my grandmother's cognitive state in her final years had been declining, and that any suggestion of impropriety was a deeply hurtful attack on a devoted son's character. His lawyer submitted a letter from a general practitioner stating that my grandmother had shown signs of cognitive change in the last 18 months of her life. Adriana submitted my grandmother's medical records. The GP who had written that letter had seen her 4 times in those 18 months, all brief appointments for blood pressure monitoring. Her neurologist, whom she saw regularly for a mild essential tremor, not dementia, had assessed her cognitive function as fully intact at her last appointment, 7 months before she died. Then Adriana submitted the folder, the margin notes, the printed email, the dated account statements with my grandmother's handwriting alongside each suspicious transaction. There was a court date. Raymond and Diane sat on one side of the room. My mother and I sat on the other. I had worn a blazer. My hands were completely still. Raymond's lawyer argued that the documents were incomplete, that the email was taken out of context, that my grandmother's annotations reflected confusion rather than clarity. Adriana put the printed email on the screen at the front of the room. She had the metadata pulled from the original file my grandmother had scanned and saved a digital copy, it turned out, on her old HP printer scanner, and that file had been automatically backed up to a USB drive she kept in the filing cabinet. The scan metadata showed the date, the time, and the device. Doris's HP OfficeJet, the 14th of December 2023, 11:42 a.m. 4 months before Raymond began telling anyone her cognition was slipping. She had scanned that email herself. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had been building a record because she was sharp enough and careful enough to understand that no one was going to believe the old woman over her son unless the old woman left proof. The judge looked at the email on the screen for a long moment. Raymond's lawyer said something about context. The judge held up one hand and he stopped talking. The court removed Raymond as executor. An independent estate trustee was appointed. A full forensic accounting was ordered. What the forensic accounting found over the following 4 months was this: $241,000 had been moved out of my grandmother's accounts under the power of attorney. Of that, approximately $34,000 could be substantiated as legitimate expenses: pharmacy, home care top-ups, groceries, the things an elderly woman actually needs. The remaining $207,000 had been transferred in segments to a holding account registered to Raymond's property management company. From there, it had been dispersed variously to a renovation on the Innisfil house, Braden's car lease, the Whistler trip, and a series of what were listed in the company books as consulting fees paid to Diane. Raymond's lawyer negotiated. Raymond did not want a criminal referral. The settlement required Raymond to repay $207,000 to the estate, with interest, within 18 months. He was permanently barred from acting as an executor or holding power of attorney in Ontario. The repayment effectively required him to sell the Innisfil house. The trust allocations, the $40,000 each for Braden and for me, were restored from the recovered funds. My mother received her full share of the estate, including half the proceeds from the eventual sale of the Barrie house. Braden, I noticed, returned the BMW sometime in the spring. He is now driving a 10-year-old Hyundai. I don't know if Raymond ever understood that it was the filing cabinet that undid him, that his own mother, sitting alone in her house with her paper brain and her blue pen, had quietly, methodically, over months, documented everything he was taking, that she had walked into a TD branch alone and told her financial advisor exactly what she wanted, that she had printed that email and written why in the margin, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted it on record that she had asked. She was sharper than they thought. She always was. The last thing I did, the week the settlement was finalized, was go back to Barry one more time. The house had sold by then. A family from Mississauga had bought it. They were planning to repaint, put in new floors. I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes before I got back in my car. I thought about my grandmother writing those birthday cards every year. The $20 bill. The same line, every time. You are sharper than you know. Don't let them dull you. She had spent the last 2 years of her life being told her mind was going, being treated like someone who couldn't be trusted with her own accounts, her own history, her own money, and she had sat with that quietly, and she had kept her paper brain running anyway. She had documented and filed and scanned and saved and waited for someone to open the drawer. I opened the drawer. She knew someone would. I got in my car, and I drove back to Ottawa, and I called my mother, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular, her students, a show she was watching, whether I was eating properly, normal things. The kind of conversation you can only have once the other thing is finally over. Before we hung up, my mother said, she would have liked you, you know, the version of you she got to see at the end. She would have been proud. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, I know. She told me, and she had, every year, on my birthday, in her careful handwriting on a card with a $20 bill inside. You are sharper than you know. She was right.